All right, everyone, we are live. Welcome back to Lift High the Cross podcast. I'm your host, Ray Sexton, and today I have a special guest with you. I've got my good friend, Colton Taussig, with me. Colton, how are you doing?
I'm doing dandy, brother. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good, good. We're going to have a lot of great conversations regarding a lot of your past history, a lot of fun theological conversations. We were able to have breakfast/coffee together, so that was a really good to keep up with you. But how you doing? What's been up?
Nothing too crazy lately. I recently graduated from Queen's University, Belfast, and I'm currently the deputy political director of the Missouri GOP. And so we're currently running politics, running operations, doing get out the vote efforts. Primaries are done, so now we're moving on to general election, which is going to be a nice second half of the career opportunity here. So yeah, and then also, in time when candidates want, we also do policy curation as well. So
well, let's start with that. What's the political deputy chief for the GOP? Let's start with that.
Yeah. So like what my job entitles?
Yeah.
So for the most part, it's a glorious title to basically coordinate. I mean, more than anything else, whether we like it or not, operations, once they get to a certain size, require people literally coordinating, and that's for the most part all they do. So a lot of what my time looks like is spent making sure that the guys in the southwest of Missouri, the RPDs in Kansas City and St. Louis, they're all having a good job. The candidates feel like they're succeeding. The canvassing operations, the door knocking, which I also do, is going well. We're hitting the numbers we want to hit. All of that requires, constant phone calls and a willingness to every now and then pull out the laptop to make sure that everything's running on time, running on speed. So yeah, it's nothing too crazy. When candidates want, I'm always willing to meet with them and craft policy with them. Policy is one of my favorite things. As you know, my experience, volunteering for Eric Burleson's campaign in 2022 for Congress, and then I interned with Senator Josh Hawley as his national security intern when his national security advisor was Luke Nicastro. And yeah, just had a great time working in the policy field. Got my bachelor's in politics, philosophy, and economics. So all those corners of the world really interest me.
Now, I think a good way to introduce you a little bit more is coming. Obviously, we got a lot of great things coming up with your conversion to Orthodoxy. Talk a little bit more about your a lot of your more rationalism between a lot of your political beliefs that I want to talk about. But I think a great way to start is, why are you going into the political field? I mean, that's I think that'll be a good icebreaker to start out with, because with a lot of people our age, I mean, most people don't even want to stay out of politics because right away, the
So
idea
true.
of like everything's corrupted, everything's against us. We're gonna have to wait for the next 20, 30 years before we're old enough where we actually have control of some of these policies, and there's not much we can do. And that's kind of the most of the attitudes that we have of a lot of young men our age. So, and also, why local politics? Why something a lot more fancier? Why something a lot more relaxing?
No, absolutely. I think I absolutely agree with you. I would say it's twofold. One, men are pretty, angry. They're upset. They have every right to be how things are currently running, and there's a general anxiety, a general deluge that is, manifesting itself here in America. I would say that anxiety, that panic, that's partially because they're not willing to do something, to start moving towards goals. I'm in politics because I want to see change. I believe young men should go into politics because I believe they actually want change too. I think they're maybe a little scared of the intimidation of political circles, of political operation, of what that looks like. But my desire is for them to realize that, one, you can always get involved. You can anyone can knock a door, right? Start there, because that does make a difference. And then ultimately what we want is change. We're all aware of how things are going, right? Affordability, when we're looking at the ideological issues of our day, the culture issues of our day, abortion, transgenderism, marriage as an institution is failing, divorce rates are up, welfare as a system in America is failing. Like it's not working. It's not providing the results that we want to see. And yet, what do we do about it? Instead of fearing, instead of fretting, we have to be willing to say, let's do something. Let's make a change. When looking at welfare, let's say these welfare benefit cliffs. Well, let's extend those to such a way that when someone makes more money We slowly phase out the welfare benefits instead of dropping them off all at once to disincentivize work. Instead, now we're incentivizing work. We're incentivizing a better life. We're incentivizing a way out. Things like this can actually change people's lives. And once people get over the fact that institutions are, for better and for worse, prone to power grabs, prone to fallout, and all these things, and they're just willing to stick with it and stick in it, you can start to see the change that you always wanted. I mean, in the end, Ray, I'm in politics, and specifically local politics, because I believe I can make a difference. And I believe all young men can, put in the right position. And by utilizing the things we have at our disposal, the tools, we can see that change affect not just our lives, but those around us. And that's why specifically local politics, because you can go to D.C. and big things happen in D.C., right? Absolutely. And it does have national waves. But a lot of the things that happen in D.C., you usually fail, at least in a general sense, walking around the neighborhood, fail to see in your day-to-day life. But I tell you what the state legislature does, what amendments pass and what amendments don't pass, that affects you and me right now in our little neck of the woods in the Ozarks, one might say, right? That affects us. That affects our neighbors. That affects our friends. That affects our families. I'm just asking for young men to look around, know that they want change, and just say, well, you know what? Just start doing it. If not us, who, right?
Yeah.
So that would be my answers to those.
Yeah, that's really good. Because like I said before, a big concern that I find a lot of young men at my age, like even if they're not bums, they're working, they're trying hard to make a difference. They're well involved in our church, and a lot of good things locally. But when it comes to local politics, and then also just our national politics, there just seems to be some just restraint from it. And it's fair, because we've been living in a political realm that's been always worried about what we've been doing for the past 60 years, or in casting our old ways, and problems with a lot of corruption going on. And right now we have this really weird time where we actually are moving, our attitudes are moving in a positive direction for all the young people. But the problem is we're not wanting to act on into our positivity. And so we have all the old people, and the majority of them are going, we're going to enjoy the next 10, 12 years of our lives, because that's the rest you have left. And like I've been able to reap the rewards of the American dream. I don't care about America of the future, so I'm going to leave it at that. And then you have people our age, they're in this super sticky situation, because not a lot of people are wanting to shift and make things stay well and or go back to the way things were. And now we're in this like 25, 35 year window where things are just going to could just lead to a lot of big problems. And you can argue, well, this was the past's fault, and like I can't buy a house for under $100,000 anymore, and so there's nothing I can do about it. I'm just gonna sit around and do this. So you have the problem with people that are stopping for change, but you also have people that are not fighting for a change. Yeah. And I think a lot of people just think there's nowhere to start. We can't move around. We've got our independent media. We can do these things, but in reality, it doesn't really matter. And that's a problem, because we do still have our freedoms. We can shift for a change. There's just a lot of work. And in reality, we are in a spot where we're going to need to start building up soon. We are at a process where things are down. We need to build up. It's our multi-billion-dollar franchise is down. It's time to rebuild. It's time to start things. But there's one thing: you could be the Detroit Lions and actually finally rebuild and start your super team, or you can stay like the Dolphins or the Bengals and just stay awful.
Yeah. God bless all the Dolphins and Bengals fans out there. No, I absolutely agree. I would say that we are at a turning point regarding what Gen Z is going to become as a political force. And what I can say from a place of observation is that both parties in the youth wings want to cast positive visions. And what I mean by positive visions is affirming something, not just being reactionary, not just denying the negatives. Well, I'm against this, I'm against this, I'm against this, which for better and for worse, Republicans have basically been for the last 40 years, right? We stopped being institutionally focused, and we started being anti-institution, anti-establishment. The problem with that is institutions affect change, whether we like it or not. And the answer is not to retreat. The answer is to move in when it gets uncomfortable, and continue to push, because that is what the cultural Marxists of the day in the 60s onward, through intersectionality, et cetera, all these policies came from a minority of people with ideological fervor who decided to infiltrate all the institutions. And, they're effective. Whether we like it or not, Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals really paved the way for them to get the change they wanted, right? And don't even get me started on the Frankfurt School or all these other influential figures that, promote this end. Me being, a Republican, the deputy political director of the Missouri GOP, sees the same inclination among our youth. We just have to tap into that. We have to say, hey, there actually can be change. Hey, you're anti-establishment. What you're really saying is you're against the way people are doing things. What you're not saying is the establishment itself, the institution is bad, right? It needs to be transformed. That can happen, but it can only happen, it can only happen if we are willing to go into the institution. And that, for conservatives, since the 80s, has been kind of a no-no. Things start getting bad, we'll just leave, Public school's getting bad, we'll just homeschool, right? Oh, church, we're having divisions, we'll just schism, we'll create our own thing. And it's nice for a generation, but then we all believe these different things, and we're all decentralized. So we can't actually affect any of the change we want to see on the national stage because we gave up all that power. We gave up all those institutions. And they will be filled, whether we like it or not. Society requires institutions to operate. So they're going to get filled. They're going to fill the church. They're going to fill the government. They're going to fill education, right? And they're going to cast judgment. We have to stop pretending that if they, we got to stop pretending that if they're going to do something, that we shouldn't respond in equal measure because we're beautiful losers or whatever. I don't know. We have to be willing to say, well, here's these institutions. Let's push for them. Let's get inside them. And then begin to manifest the change that they want, right? Every person wants to see, every person, as you know, has a conception of the good. They want to actualize that conception. So anybody who says they're anti-establishment, what they're really saying is, I want people who are pro my conception of the good in the establishment, in the institutions. And if you can affect that change, then you're going to see benefit. And not just you, but everyone. And that is what the Republican Party needs to transform into, right? We're really good at, trying to cut taxes and trying to alleviate the tax burden. We're not really good at setting, culture setting. We're less good at saying, yes, the moral majority usually sides on the right, but we need to be more pro-vision casting in the sense of what is the responsibility of the church? What is the responsibility of the state? What is the responsibility of a Christian ethic in the state, right? And there's these hosts of questions regarding separation of church and state and what religion plays with the state. All I can say is this: everyone comes from a place of morality, and that morality is derived from something, and you can't escape it. So you might as well own it, right?
Yeah.
Don't obfuscate. That defeats the purpose. If you say you're a Christian, legislate like one. If you say you're an atheist, legislate from whatever you derive your sense of morality, but just be upfront about it. Enough of the pitter-pattering and pretending, right? It just won't work anymore. Everyone's tired and sick of it. We require people to simply say, these are the things I stand for. This is what I believe. And I'm going to do everything in my power to legislate accordingly. Perfectly reasonable. And more men of integrity are going to be coming in because they're going to be willing to just stand on their stuff, So there's a host of issues there.
Are you familiar with Luther's perception of the two kingdoms within the political field?
I am not. City of God is the way I...
Well, I have to mention it because it's not only just deeply rooted in our Lutheran doctrine, but also it's, it goes a lot to what you said because, it's interesting. You can take Luther's view on it and say that it's pro-nationalist, but it's also separation between church and state as well. So Luther developed the two kingdom doctrine of saying that there needs to be separation of the church and separation between the civil governance, seeing that there's a realm, the eternal realm, which is the church, and then the civil realm through our governance. Yeah. And that's maintenance of the law and maintenance of the gospel, which the gospel is the church, and then our government is the law, pushing both sides of Christ's order. And you can go both ways. You can go extreme on those ideologies, or you can kind of soften it up a little bit because you can say that there is a necessity to division between the two. Because there was something like that when in the 1500s when Luther was a monk, but the problem was the Pope had as much authority as all the kings did. And so when there's your leaders have that much political power, that's going to cause anarchy. And when there's trouble and problems with going on within the church, things will shatter. There'll be problems because there's too much political power within the church. But then, that can also go the same way as well. Because I mean, not even 4 years ago, our country, that's been the case for a long time, that we don't have church encouraged within our government. And when that's not the case, that's when evil will come. That's when the law is not pushed. That's when just common sense becomes foreign to people, and you just have that big issue. And so I always have a fun time mentioning that source of doctrine to Catholics, Orthodox, because there's a lot of agreements between the two. But then it goes back to a Catholic will say, well, it's necessary for the Pope to have that much authority because X, Y, and Z. Because I mean that's the way that things are. That's why God established Peter to be the first bishop of Rome. And so you get into all those discussions about actual church authority, but there is you can't be arrogant when it does come that there is a separation of the two, because God didn't just pound the law for eternity. He also gave the gospel. He gave Christ. There is going to be room for mistakes because we are sinful flesh. So there needs to be forgiveness. That's what keeps us the drive, keeps us moving. And that's why we need to be able to push those two, because, it goes back to the balance between needs to be grace, but there also needs to be movement of the law, because if you only have one or the other, you're going to have a lot of problems.
See, of course, I'm not going to claim for all Orthodox, but from an Orthodox position, I would say I see separation as a strong word. Word distinction might be more appropriate for me in light of hearing this concept for the first time. When I hear about these things, I believe that in order to affect that kind of change that you want to see, like if you want to have, for all intents and purposes, a society that boasts Christian virtues, boasts Christian morale, right? Boasts the name of Christ proudly, requires the state and the church to have intimate affairs with one another.
It's also different because during that time, even all the kings and power authorities were all Christian.
Absolutely.
That's important to point out as well.
But I would say, looking at the distinction, right? They're constitutive of one another. They play in a cycle, the church and the state.
Right.
If you want to have a moral authority that derives itself from God, right? You have to first recognize that there's a constitutive cycle at play, which is the state affects church, church affects state, vice versa, onward.
Mm-hmm.
And so from that, it all comes from the Lord, right? The Lord appoints the rulers, right? He appoints the judges. From that place, for me, I see it more as a distinction, because we can distinguish between the church and the state, and that's helpful and good. But in order to affect the change that I genuinely think would be required to have for all intents and purposes, a Christian society, requires the church to have, a intimacy with the state that other institutions do not have access to. And the only reason I think that's the case is because, as you see over time, when there's a distinction, they drift apart. And so when you tether them together, you're going to be less faced with that query of, will they break up? Will they not? All these questions. And then there's always that common denominator, right? That common denominator between church and state, where they might disagree, right? And there can be both a political and a theological conversation at the same time. Because together, they can actually get us closer to a practical practice of the truth. Practical practice of the truth. A more correct practice of the truth. When you divorce them from one another and how they operate, you're going to find yourself in very strange positions.
Would you rather have divorce or abusive relationship?
Well, I would simply argue that an abusive relationship comes about through decay and corruption. I think you and I are in a fundamental, probably on opposite ends on how we view power, right? You're probably of the mindset of maybe Lord Acton, right? Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. I am more the mindset that, and all kudos to Eric Schmidt on this, power reveals, right? There's no escape from that. Power reveals. God is omnipotent. He's not corrupt. Now, we could talk about whether that has anything to do with humans whatsoever, but in regards to the fact that I would just reckon with that power does reveal who you are. It can have a corrupting effect. I won't deny it, but it ultimately showcases what's really there. And I think to me, that means there are such things as good kings, and there are such things as bad kings, and there are such things as good senators and bad senators, and good congressmen and bad congressmen. In the end, you get the same result. Whether you decentralize power or consolidate it, the question has little to do with the system. It has to do with who are the actors. There are good actors and bad actors, right? And so to me, I don't see it as necessarily being an abusive relationship, especially from a framework of the Orthodox Church having multiple different jurisdictions, being a universal church across the globe, right? You might have a patriarch over here, right? You got to worry about church leadership, right? Not just political leadership. Sometimes the political leaders aren't the ones that corrupt; it's the patriarch that's corrupt. You know what I mean? And usually they play hand in hand with one another. Don't get me wrong, but there's a place where I think the reality of the church and the state, it's more complicated than merely, well, it's an abusive relationship, we have to divorce. It's more like it's a constant evolution. Taking into context the time, the place, the social norms, and it's a constant conversation. But by all means, keep talking.
You're saying we need to be constantly reforming.
No, I'm not saying that. I am because I got the gist there. I don't deny the synonym you're using. To me, it's more just though it's not really reforming because I don't think there's anything we really need to reform. It's more just about evolving, constant dialogue as we just move ever more into the presence of God. And yeah, there will be setbacks, but that doesn't mean we're still not trying to move forward.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of where I'd stand.
I get the gist of that, but if I was going to go in the more theological perspective and then go full Luther on you,
please do. I was waiting. I was waiting for the full Luther approach. I'm like, oh God.
But yeah, it's it's definitely more from the theological perspective when I say this rather than the political realm. But then when you recognize that we are all corrupted, and so there is going to be confusion. There is going to be. I mean,
you're coming from a guy who believes in ancestral sin, not
exactly.
original sin. So we're going to have a little different view.
Exactly, and
of the
so
matter.
but when you look into that view of things, you need to recognize that even though a senator can mean well and do these different things, there's going to be problems within it. That's why there has to be being able to look through things and being able to make changes in the right way. And I think it's. You can disagree with this or not. I think that it could also be a pride issue of saying that we have this great country. There really we don't need to say per se we need to reform. We don't need to change this way. And that you can obviously say that within different church bodies. There doesn't need to be a change. And that's why a good friend of mine, Pastor Eisenberg, he says there's not in church matters, there's not changing, there's enhancing. And recognizing that yes, we are universal. We do believe in the one true God, but because we are corrupted in our sins, that's why we need to always be looking through Scripture and looking through the church and being able to interpret what's right and what's wrong. Because I can be at the most conservative Lutheran church that does traditional liturgy, that's giving the sacraments, and not only giving the sacraments, but are expressing the importance of the gifts of the church. But there can still be so many problems with that, whether it's the political side of a church and or if it's more the cultural side of it. There can maybe people that are trying to push more progressive ideologies, or you have some people that are becoming way too extreme with their political beliefs. And that's just the point of realizing that as beautiful as church can be, we're still corrupted. There's always going to be change. And, like you said, it's from God. That's what we need to be making the face of. And, it comes down to whether we think there is good in some places down here in this realm, or whether they're not. And so, and that's the kind of the big way of looking at it.
And to me, I would just take that and I would say, and that's why the political and theological have to talk.
Exactly.
Because once again, just how we view humans, right? Coming from a background where, you of course have the Augustinian route, which is original sin, and then you have, and that can derive itself into, you can get to tulip, right? You can get to total depravity, total, what's the word I'm looking for?
Deprived.
Deprivation, or that's not the word I'm looking for.
That goes like even farther than corruptedness. I mean, the reason why a Lutheran wouldn't say deprived is that it's the ideology of tulip, saying that we've been deprived in our sins and sinful from the start, which from the Lutheran perspective is that we were perfect at one point. God did give us the freedom, but once original sin started, that was when we were corrupted from the sin of Adam. So that's why we put the corruptedness of it.
Let me ask this. When you say perfect, what does that mean? Because you're saying before we sinned, we were perfect. And now to some exegesis on Genesis. What does it mean to be perfect? I'm just curious. Because you think we're going to go back to that state in heaven, or do you think there's going to be a different state altogether?
Well, I would say perfection is what what God saw in us when he first created us, because when he created us, he called us good. I mean, you can definitely find the different interpretation of what is good or not, but what I would consider is perfect is what God saw us in our creation, what he established, because I think family is I think the idea of a family, servanthood, the gospel, the found institutions, I mean, those are good in the eyes of God, and the structure that he gave us on this world is perfect, because you can go from the biological sense, the philosophical sense, the spiritual sense. This is all goodness from God, and that's what I would call perfect. And so, but then there is also kind of the mysteries between that and like what we should find terms on. But that's like the core of Lutheran ideology. Is just, there was a time where God did give us a perfected world, but we also did have free will at some point. That's the and we could be wrong about that. It's also the cop out from our Lutherans, because we can say one thing, but because it's in the areas of what we don't know, what God hasn't revealed to us, this is just our assumption that when sin came in, that's when there's sin in the world. That's when there was imperfection, and that's when things went off, and that's why we needed Christ to come on the air. So that's kind of the reasoning between that, and so that's why not American Protestants, but the traditional Protestant Reformation, that's why we, the big push for that is that we are corrupted in our sins. That's why we need Christ from the church. We don't need the satisfaction from what men tell us. We don't need the satisfaction of doing works within. That we need God. We need the gospel, and but there's also like a lot of like places between like the Reformation that people get wrong, like how Catholics will tell us like, well, you say that Scripture doesn't need an interpreter. Like, no, you need interpretation of the Bible. How are you going to be able to use Christ's words if you don't have people in the church? There is value between these traditions, but it kind of goes back to sanctifying, which becoming holy, God giving you this forgiveness of sins and becoming righteousness. But it's also from the big point of like, who is giving that to you? Is it the church of tradition or the church of the people, or is it God that's giving you that authority? And so I would define it as we are being sanctified because we're being justified, but we're not being justifying of our sanctification, because we are given gifts to become sanctified, which is also through the hands of our sinful flesh. But it's recognizing, is this credit to the priest that's giving you absolution, or is it the gift of what Christ is giving you from the spiritual sense of it? Kind of like how the Eucharist unifies us and it helps us give us the absolution. And it not only gives us forgiveness of our sins, but it's connecting us to the spiritual church, the universal Catholic Church. And I have that at my church. You have that in your church. We definitely will differ from the internal perspective of the Eucharist, and saying that yes, it is an establishment of tradition, in which it is, but not in the sense of a practice within the church. It's a tradition because that's what Jesus established 2,000 years ago, giving us gifts of absolution. I don't do that as a chore of the church. I do that as a way of, this is what gets me away from my corruptedness. This is what connects me to God. It also goes back to a little bit of a theosis of your definition of connecting with God and becoming sanctified. There's a lot of value in that perspective, but it also comes to the sense of theosis is only the side of having to be in a certain church, having to have this connection. You could disagree with this, but I think you can have somewhat theosis within different church bodies. But the problem is, even though the Holy Spirit can work through this Baptist church or this Pentecostal church, there's still a lot of evil and a lot of different corruption that's not healthy ways of being connected to God. I mean, that's why a Lutheran church is not going to speak in tongues. We're not going to do a baptism for revival. We're not going to say that this is the perspective we're going to go into because we need to give your life to Christ. No, we know where we're going to be connected to Christ, and it's a battle we have to keep going. But it does come to like a issue of pride, trying to give credit to yourself, trying to give credit to the church, and rather just to acknowledge who we are, what we need to save, and just give humility to yourself and look to Christ for the problems within your sinfulness.
I value the perspective. I guess something I would add to the dialogue is from what metric, from what place, and at what point do we say, well, this is too much or this is too little? And I think to me, one of the reasons orthodoxy is such a convincing claim is because it's willing to just draw lines in the sand, not to say that God isn't outside those lines, but for the purpose of salvation, for the purpose of unity, for the purpose of right practice, the correct way, literally orthodox, if we have to etymologically spell it out, I would say that there is a fundamental where we look at Scripture and we look at the traditions, we look at history all together in a coherent piece of fabric. And as we feel the fabric out, we can recognize why things are the way they are, right? And I think because of that, I'm from a point of view where when looking at the definitions of things, when looking at first issues, second issues, third issues, someone has to say that's a first issue. Someone has to say that's a second issue, right? And then you get a smattering of different opinions and a smattering of different circumstances. And as you know, we live, in a rational world where if, right, X and Y cannot both be true at the same time, well then where does that leave us? And usually what I have been, at least in my observations, what I pick from that is that there's just a general deluge of secularism in the Protestant world, which is to say, well, we all actually sing Kumbaya, even though these things mean fundamentally different things to each other. What a baptism is to the Baptist and what a baptism is to the Lutheran are fundamentally different. And my point in that being is, well, who's right, right? Because you could both be wrong, but you can't both be right.
Yeah.
And even though we want to say, well, they can do it that way, they can perceive the tradition that way, what I hear is, well, it just really doesn't matter. Like doing it the right way or having it be in a place where there is an actual understanding of what it does, right, coming from like the camp of baptismal regeneration. If we miss that, well, then we miss the point. Like we actually miss the point entirely. And that's where I would distinguish myself from maybe the camp you're going to, which is more of a universal church camp, where, right, as an Orthodox, it's in the claim, we're the one true church.
Yeah.
That's the argument. That's the claim. And I'm going to fall on that sword, not out of a place of hatred at all. Like, came from a Protestant background, love Protestants. I mean, they are fantastic. And they live very, very, I would say, in pursuit of Christ, very godly lives. But in the end, when it comes down to these important things, where do we draw the line? Where's the normative authority at play? Who has the authority to make these claims? And ultimately, who's staying on point, right? Because when I look at the Orthodox Church, and I'm sure people will come into the comments from all denominations to jump on this, and I understand. But the claim of the Orthodox Church is the claim, which is we are the church at the beginning, right? It is God. Like when you're talking about sola scriptura, when you're talking about what God is doing, whether it's the priest or it's God, who we're giving glory to, right? It is God, but it's God's church. Christ is the head of it, and we are the body. And so in view of that, we are making a bold claim in saying that this is the way Christ wants it to be. Not because of us. We're all, I'm a wretched sinner. But because in virtue of that, Christ protects, Christ preserves. And so in light of history, we can very well just systematically work our way through the historic timeline and come to conclusions about why things exist the way they do.
Right.
And you have to have faith, of course.
Yes.
You have to have faith in, well, this institution is correct or this institution is incorrect. But in the end, the faith, right? You have to have faith there. That you can't, like I always say this, and sometimes this makes some people mad. I don't think you can reason your way to a denomination explicitly. I think you can reason your way out of certain denominations, absolutely, in light of historic evidence, in light of history, in light of, right? But there's some denominations, like, for example, the Catholic claims versus the Orthodox claims. Well, I would make an evidence claim that, the Orthodox Church is correct, but in the end, who do you put your faith in? In the authority, right? Because we're all saying we put our faith in Christ. Everybody's saying that. But what I'm not hearing is, who's Christ? And that's not to obfuscate the character of Christ at all. But it is to say, well, when I go to a very charismatic church, one might say I get a different point of view about whose Christ is, who his character is, what my relationship and proximity to him is, than I go to the Orthodox Church, right? And the distinction for me is Jesus is my boyfriend right here, and Jesus is my king over here. Now, we're making claims about the character. Those things could both be true at the same time, but Which one is more closer in proximity to who he is and what our relationship should be with him?
Well, I think the answer to that is that there's no definite term of definition because Christ is king, but he's also our savior. And I think,
and he's also our friend, and he's our
Messiah,
our master,
our master, our teacher,
all
and
these
our
things.
servant.
Yeah,
and that's what.
Is there anything he's not?
Exactly, and so, and from the Lutheran perspective, and especially coming from the Protestant Reformation and how we look at things and why there needed to be change is because the perspective of how we can find Christ and where he's at and who he is because we need to be looking from an external perspective. And so the Orthodox Church, they do have a great way of expressing the external faith of Christ and understanding, and especially more than Catholics, because you guys value more of the more mystery side of the authority of God or who he is or how he presents himself, which that's something
Miralowski's mystical theology.
Yeah,
shout out.
That's something that's very appreciated. And so, and obviously it's not hard to look at the way that Protestantism has completely flipped and has become exclusively an internal religion. And I mean, you can have like your Anglican, your conservative Anglicans, your maybe at least your Baptists that are fully rooted in Scripture, or a couple of these Reform guys that do claim to have regenerational baptism or at least some sense of spiritual presence of the Eucharist.
Yeah.
But you do come to the point of when you have too much internalism inside of you and within the church, then how much of Christ are you actually having within your church? And I think that was also the big problem why eventually the schism happened between the Lutherans and the Catholics, which gave us kind of an awkward situation because we believe that there's a lot of internal problems within a lot of these high churches. But then the bad side of it is that when this disconnection happened, when we got kicked out, then you have all these different reformers that were expressing more internal ways of thinking, when more of the tulip, wanting to preserve yourself because since you don't know if you're in the elect or not, you need to be doing this certain things of pushing the law, pushing the gospel so you can feel better, but you'll still not know. Or obviously the Zwingli presence of the Lord's Supper, or going from the more nominalist perspective of it's not what the external presence of God is, it's more of the internal presence of how you perceive him, how you view him. That's what counts. And then when you have that critical thinking, that's when a lot of bad things happen.
Oh, yeah.
And that's why there's the preserving of the church is super important. But from the perspective is the reason why that's not happening, it's not because we're just sticking to one church. It's the people within the church that are corrupted in their sins that are having a lot of problems. Because I think we can both agree that, there's a lot of problems that are going along in the Catholic Church that needed to be fixed. And they've, of course, have repented from that.
I would say when looking at the Catholic Church, and this is someone who I'm sure can get schooled in plenty of things, right? My philosophy was, even when reading the 95 Theses, it seemed to be more of a political issue than a theological one. Initially, 15, 17, right, at the 95 Theses. By the Diet of Worms, it felt more to be a entirely different matter altogether. Yeah. But at least to me, initially, Luther's concerns dealt more to do specifically with the politics of the church, far less to do with the theology of the church. And what I can say is from history, we've always had political problems with the church. Like, this isn't new. I mean, this is why we have the ecumenical councils, for crying out loud. So there's many times when our patriarch even, right, I believe it was the Patriarch of Constantinople, cut off the tongue and hands of Maximus the Confessor when preaching about the nature of Christ, saying that the Patriarch had it wrong. I'm not going to say specifics so I don't walk into a heresy all of a sudden. But regarding that, the patriarchs, can be wrong, and they have to be deposed and a new one placed in, and there's that accountability among the patriarchs to safeguard us. But that doesn't mean that the church went astray, right? And so to me, it's there's political matters and there's theological matters and there's course correct, right? But that doesn't mean to me that the church just totally falls off the wayside, right? Yeah. Because at least from the patriarch model, you can have one patriarch who's kind of veering off. Does that mean that the church, all the jurisdictions are wrong? No, not at all. In fact, there's many times in history when certain churches have schismed off from one another, but they're all connected, right, from one another. So they're actually all still together. There's just that complicatedness when it comes to the political landscape, right? I mean, look at Ukraine and Russia right now. That's a huge thing. But it's once again just reliving past experiences, past history, right? That's what people used to do. The countries fight each other. Church is like, well, you're not a real church, and you're a real church, and it goes back and forth. But the church is still whole. Whereas to me, that has little to do with, the politics of it, which I think Luther, at least my reading of Luther, which I could be totally wrong. I haven't read much, I'll be honest. 95 Theses, read the Diet of Worms, summaries of the Diet of Worms, the letter to the peasants about the revolt, right?
Yeah. Luther spoke like a politician, but I would say there'd be a lot other people that were, you can argue that in the Lutheran era from that time that were more political. And also the Augsburg Confession, which is the foundation of what we still use as our confessions, which was written by Philip Melanchthon, and he was definitely more of a political head. But that from that point of view, from like when they went to the council and were talking to John Eck and Charles V, it was trying to realize that we are one church and we do need to have Christ in the head of everything, but we need to realize that there are political issues that are causing us from doing that. And obviously the pushing for purgatory and paying for time off and indulgences and things like that. But then at the end, the Augsburg Confession isn't addressing the political problems within the 95 Theses. It was the whole reason of the Augsburg Confession is to convince that the Catholic Church is that we're not trying to become Muslims. We're not trying to become Mormons by any means necessary. We're Christians, and we want to establish that we believe in the same God. That's why that's why a lot of Lutherans, if you talk to someone and they'll say like, what would be the first thing to look at if I want to get into Lutheranism? They'll say, go read the 32 articles of the Augsburg Confession, because it's not just purely on the doctrine of what we believe. It's what we truly believe is what the true teachings of the Catholic Church. And so like the first 5 or 6 articles talk about the presence of God, the presence of the Holy Spirit, the incarnation of Christ. And then it goes down to the more doctrinal issues of like how the Protestants, when it talks about the Lord's Supper and how we truly believe that it's present, and we reject the Anabaptists and the different people that are criticizing or neglecting the true presence of it. That does go into more of the political side of it, but that's where I wish that's not a political side, because in the sense, before we can have political disputes, we need to be theologically connected. And I think that's it's important, but the problem is there were so many times where we tried to be politically connected rather than trying to be spiritually connected. Because Philip Melanchthon.
So it kind of sounds like what you're asking for is for the church and the state to kind of be a little connected, so you can have that theological conversation, you can have that political conversation at the same time, have a mature response.
Yeah, and so that's that was the big point of even the founding fathers and what they established. There was separation between the two, but there needs to be a connection of it, even though they were all deists. But that's that's why it's like around history there's so many political problems of the church, and how so many kings were trying to keep us spiritually connected. Like when the Missouri Synod was founded in Missouri, it was because we left because we were trying to be forced to be in communion with all the Calvinists, and that was a big no. We don't need to be rejecting that. And so there's also kind of a fine balance between the two, and obviously that's more in the theological realm, and that's that's where I lean towards. So I apologize when we go down that route.
No, it's fine.
But
don't apologize.
not only from the theological perspective, there is also we need to recognize the political problem right now of trying to be connected, and that's what we were talking about a few minutes ago, and that's kind of what the next thing I wanted to start talking about is. So
let's do it.
Yeah, so you were talking about the plan of trying to get us connected, especially people our generation. But just like how during the Protestant Reformation, how divided we were, and it's hard to be theologically connected. If we couldn't be politically connected, how in the world could we be theologically connected? And that's what's happening in our generation right now. You have people that are coming back to church, and they're going to evangelical churches, which is mostly the women, but you have all these conservative guys that are wanting to go to the Orthodox, the Catholics, the Reformed, and the Lutheran. But then you still have a lot of the woke people, and so there's a big division between that. And so we were talking about how there needs to be some attitude of believing Christ is king, and we need to be pushing that from the political and theological perspective. But that's not always going to be, from my sense, that's not always going to be the right way to approach things. Because like when we were talking about during breakfast, you said that when it comes to dialogues, conversations, and reaching out to people, you lean more to the left. And I mean, that's absolutely agree with you. That's what we need.
I think being compassionate, humanizing people as best we can, and coming from a pro-compassionate response. I think that is something the left does well that the right should co-opt, if that makes sense.
And so how do we push that over? Because it's come to the point where conservatism is it's almost more divided than the liberal people. And
well, it's close. I mean, if you're looking at the DSA right now, the Democratic Socialists of America, they're going to have their, if things keep going the way they're going, they're going to have their own schism too.
I know. Yeah. And so how do we fix that? Because I mean, we're always going to be we were talking about how it's going to be hard to at least negotiate or talk with people that are completely different from the political side of it. But now it's coming to the point where we have to start negotiating, talking through, and being humane with people that claim to be on our side. So how is not only from the present day, which is going to be a heck of a battle, but also in probably the most important battle is the next 20, 30-year run of training the people our age that are going to be running our country someday. How can we get that in a positive movement?
Oh man, you're asking hard questions. My pessimism wants to respond, but I'm going to just
throwing them all at
you. Right. I would say, my pessimism wants to say, well, we might just be toast, my good man. But
turn the podcast.
Right. I was about to say maybe we need to cut cameras. I'll whisper you some secret information. Everything's falling apart now. The reality is, Gen Z is the most radical generation, for better and for worse. The huge benefits of that is that they are going to do stuff differently than the previous 3 generations, and that very well could be, a saving effect on the people. It could also be a destructive effect on the people, so much that America itself is gone. People need to get existential about this. That's why it's so important to get into politics, because it is existential. Everything's being politicized. Everything's being ideological. Everything's become ideological. This is kind of an in-game point, if that makes sense.
Well, sidebar, I mean, that's why most conservative Lutherans aren't engaged in politics or even trying to push for office or anything like that, is because from our establishment of being humble and saying that we are corrupted and we need Christ in the face of everything, we don't like to go out there. So you have more guys that are not pushing. It's more the Reform side and the Catholic side that are going that, and so there's just very little people from that side.
The Lutherans, I just say that you need to get more aggressive, because what happened to the Quakers, who are also pretty humble?
Exactly. So actually,
to me, it's it is existential, and when talking about the future, we need to get real about what is it that people are screaming in the streets about. Right? There's the things we agree on. And that sounds shocking coming from the Republican Party to some Democratic aisle. Affordability, cost of living, ability to buy a home, afford the American dream, the ability to, trust your institutions. Heck, we're looking at institutional trust. It's at an all-time low. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can see it since JFK. It's been a slow time bomb going down. Yeah. But we are towards total disassociation. And what comes with that is dehumanization. And that's the thing we have to be so careful of. When, and the right and the left have their enemies, right? On the left, you've got capitalists, rich billionaires, and the bourgeoisie, right? Just borrowing from Marxist thought. And then on the right, you have illegal aliens, you have abortion advocates, you have transgender ideology and proponents of it. And what we want to do, and the initial inclination is just tribalism, which says, I hate them, you hate them too, good, let's be friends. Mm. Totally reactionary and also explosive in proportion. Yeah. The only way to get to a solution that doesn't kill people, because I'm being dead serious when I say that, because I don't want to see anybody dead over something like this. The only way you get to a solution that doesn't kill people, you have to be willing to humanize them. Right. In spite of their hate for you. And that is what Christ ultimately did, right? He died for the world, right? In spite of the hatred and the death and the disease and all the things plaguing the earth, he died for them, right? And I think to me that needs to be the Christian response moving forward on the right in the Republican Party, is we need to be hey, we are a party that is pro-deportation. We believe we have sovereign borders. We believe that we ought to have control of our nation. Very reasonable.
Yeah.
Very, very reasonable. I like to think that the rest of the world holds America to a standard that no one else holds. I came from Switzerland with very strict immigration metrics for school. I went there for a semester. It was fantastic, but like I had to have my passport with me every single day. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't a question. It was just something you did to respect the people there because that's what the people wanted. America should be able to have that standard too.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we can still say to immigrants, right? We can still say, hey, you're a human being. Christ loves you too. We can say that as well. And at the same time, when it comes to the transgender ideology, we can hate an ideology very much because we believe it does evil things. Which I mean, look at it. I mean, castrating children, right? Kind of crazy. Kind of crazy. It's a harder one for me to get a little more humane on that. But since it to all my friends, including those who are transgender, who I have friends who are transgender, I come from a place of love, not because I am going to abide by their ideology, not because I'm going to abide by their logic or any of those things. I don't. But what I can say is they're still human, and God still made them with His image, and He still loves them, and He still wants salvation for them. What is my call of love to that person? And that love without compromise, love and truth. And if we can get to a point where we can do that and have dialogue, you will see, a revolution in a good, proper, positive sense of the word. But the reality is, do I think that's going to happen? I mean, don't mean to be a doomer over here, Ray, but probably not. So in spite of that, what we need to do in the realization that it's probably going to go a very different way is how do we love God no matter who wins, right? No matter who tries to blow up the other. We need to just come from a place of love. And if we can do that, we will be at the end, right? We will be there because after all things, right? Faith, hope, and love, the greatest of these is love. And if we can come from a place of that, have conversation, continue to dialogue, don't compromise, then maybe we can end up in a better place for everybody from our standpoint of view without the violence, without the chaos, without the destruction. Do I think that's going to happen? Probably not. But does that mean we shouldn't try? No, it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. It means we should try all the more. Yeah. Let us strive.
Preach reason with the voice of grace.
Absolutely. If it's possible, let us do it. And that doesn't mean that you can't take a stand, because I feel like so much of the dialogue condenses to, well, if you're not just emphatically want to destroy people, then you don't really care. No, not at all. I mean, heck, there's a place where we can punish people who've done evil in love, right? I mean, that's what God does all the time, right? Reinhold Niebuhr, theologian of the 1950s, made a great line when he said that. He's a Protestant theologian. I can't remember if he's Anglican or something else.
Anglo-Catholic.
Right, something to that extent. But he said that it is God's love and mercy when a man is caught in adultery. Because it is through the being caught in the consequences that he can understand what is right and what is wrong, and what is love, and be swept up in what is justice. That is grace. That is mercy. That is God's love. To many, that's unacceptable.
Yeah.
Right. How dare you go too far? Right. To me, it's a place where we can say, well, hey, we can love the person and still recognize that what they have done is abominable. And it has to be punished. And they're probably not going to change. And people need to understand that too. Christ's restoration and redemption is universal for Christians who turn to Him, right? They're going to, it's the restoration, right? And it is possible, right? I'll never eliminate possibility. But what I can say is, there's a good portion of people who, once they cross a certain line into and I don't mean to be graphic by any means, but child molestation or child murder or certain crimes, depending on how they're done, do attest to a fallenness where it is merely love to say, throw away the key. You know what I mean? And that isn't coming from a place of evil. That's coming from a place of consequence and from consequence, justice is seen and preached. And I just think that's the distinction. Like, let's go back in time a little bit. We're a little entitled. You and I were talking about this at breakfast. But one of the biggest problems with, how we think about, let's go to criminal justice, is what people think they're owed, right? And we can just look at it. People have very different definitions of what people think they're owed, right? We're living in a time where standards are increasingly being lowered, right? I mean, I think it's Kansas City, you can't fail a grade. Like, I don't think you can fail a class in Kansas City public schools.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I don't think it's possible for students to fail. You can never turn in your work and still get, I think, a 40%. That's unacceptable. I don't know about you. That's kind of insane. And to them, that's usually coming from students who come from really poor backgrounds and have a very rough life. And so I don't deny or dismiss any of those things in contributing to the outcome. But does that mean that there's no failing anymore? But does that mean that there's no standards anymore? That's not God's love, right? To not have standards is to not have God's love.
Right.
Because there is perfection, and we are called to it. And when you dismiss it for the sake of the sin in the world, well, then you dismiss Christ. Because Christ didn't say, I've died for you. Come, the universe is saved. The world is saved. Come into me and don't change, right? No, he says, let me change you. Let me change you into what you're supposed to be, right? As far as I'm concerned, we're living in a world that says everyone's perfect, everyone's special. And we're trying to live like that without acknowledging the classic mantra from The Incredibles, you gotta love syndrome. It's like, if everybody's super, nobody is, right?
Yeah. We're
right?
corrupted.
Right? And we got to be willing to raise standards again. And we got to be willing to say, I know this is tough. And I know this disproportionately affects this person, that person, this person, in spite of things that we can't control. Does that mean we don't have standards? No. It means, what are the root problems that we can fix, right, while still having standards?
Exactly.
Because we need them. And we're going to lose that. And when we lose it, then it's over. It's all over. Yeah. Because once you lose standards, any degree of excellence is merely just a subject in the imagination.
Yeah, structure and action is so important. And before we end this, I was meaning to ask you this before we even started the more theological.
I know we got sidetracked, but it was good.
But it was fantastic.
Really
No, it was fantastic. Yeah. But I wanted to ask you what led you to. I mean, I have an idea, but what led you to your conversion of Orthodoxy?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Without getting too overly semantic,
please do.
If I'm allowed. So I came from Protestant background, a myriad of Protestant experiences growing up as a kid. Evangelical Presbyterianism in North Carolina for 6 years, and a Baptist church for like 5 years, 6 years, and then another non-denominational charismatic is what I'd say. AG-related church. Assemblies of God, for those who don't know. And I went to college, and you got a church search, and I went to college in New York City my first year. So I went to the King's College in New York City, closed down my freshman year, just totally went under. And so that's how I ended up at Queen's University, Belfast. I was like, the ship is sinking. What are we going to do? And my professor, Dr. Anthony Bradley, fantastic guy, by the way, was kind of like, have you considered like schools in the UK? Never entered my mind. I was like, no, I haven't actually, not even a little bit. So I did some research, and he had done teaching at Queen's University, Belfast before, and so I was like, oh, all right. So he wrote me a rec, which still grateful for, Professor, if you're listening in. And, I submitted my papers and solid GPA, all that good stuff, so I got in, so that's why I went to Queen's. But that church search really started it there in New York City.
Okay.
And what I can say is eventually we come down to the foundational point, and you can get a little existentialist about this regarding Søren Kierkegaard, as well as Dostoevsky and all those both literary and philosophical existentialists. You kind of get to a point where you have to ask yourself, what's the foundation? What's the foundation? Because you're church searching, you're checking out all these new churches, right? And they all have a lot of different things to say about Scripture. In fact, you get wildly different conclusions depending on where you go. That can't, for all intents and purposes, cannot logically coexist. So I'm stuck in that, right? Being like, crap, well, who am I drawing my authority from? Who's my normative authority? You know what I mean? And I came to the conclusion, like, books can't read books as much as I would like them to. And that opens up the Pandora's box, right? Well, what's my history, right? What's my history? Assemblies of God and like modern day Pentecostalism, I believe you can trace back to about as early as 1900. Usually you don't find it preceding that period. So I kind of got stuck, right?
Yeah.
Retracing my non-denominational charismatic roots, you can follow it linearly till about 1900.
Well, it goes deeper than that. I mean, those were starting from the first two Great Awakenings, which, obviously you can argue with the Methodism and John Wesley, which, did do some good works. I mean, but then started in the Second Great Awakening, Charles Finney really broke the barrier and was also pushing a lot of these, not only just unbiblical practices, but just stupid practices.
Yeah, well, let's be honest.
It's terrible.
Yeah. R.I.P. to all the Methodists out there. But yeah, no, I think to me it's you can, of course, there's constant evolution. Like you can trace Pentecostalism back, but what I'm saying is like the current modern day beliefs of the Pentecostal movement don't really precede 1900 when it comes to the phenomena of how they interpret speaking in tongues and things like that. They're of course going to quote scripture. And that's great, but once again, that's back to the problem, interpretation, right?
Yeah.
How do we know that's what that means, right? And so the church has to have a say, right? It does. I mean, there really is no other way around it. But then whose church, right? What church? Where's the church, right? And I think just evaluating historical claims, when looking at the church and looking at how it operates, I really do think like the traditional Orthodox claims hold up, which is that we are the ancient church. We're still trying to do things the same way we've always done them. And when looking at just in the service, just going to the service, it's like, yeah, we really haven't changed much. You know what I mean? I think if you look at Orthodoxy, really even post last ecumenical council, for all intents and purposes, you don't really see much change regarding how the structure is. Of course, there's little things like you have the reforms in Russia in the 1700s and little things like that, how people make the sign of the cross. But by and large, when looking at the dogma and looking at the practice of the dogma, which is doctrine and the theologomena, it is a historical continuity that I think is open to mystery. Like you said, that's something you appreciate about the Orthodox, but yet very rationally based too. I think some things that current people do when they talk about Orthodoxy, they obfuscate our reason and our rationality in favor of the more mystical side. I think we are very much a mystical church, but I think there's absolutely a connection, right? But it is based in experience, right? The divine light that comes and illuminates saints and seeing the uncreated light. These are mystical experiences that inform our theology, right? We're not going to dismiss experience so long as there's prayer, accountability, and ultimately like movement towards obedience, right? That's something that's really important. And so like you'll look at like the Stieglites of the ancient monastic period, right? And they're all like, these guys were just sitting up there on their little like tower. They never get down. Are they like with the Lord? Are they not with the Lord? And I remember, oh my goodness, it was one of the very, very famous Stieglites. His authority came to him and says, get off the tower, and he just descends automatically down, right? It's like, all right, this guy's good. You know what I mean? This guy understands, and then he just goes right back up when they're good to go. And I think there's that accountability, there's that mystical theology, there's that reason. All of it compounds to, I think, make very good claims about history. And ultimately, when it comes down to it, you got to have the biggest distinction, the biggest claim, which is, okay, well, who is Orthodoxy competing with on this historical continuity? Well, it's competing with, of course, for the sake of the historic Protestants, we'll lop you in there. But by and large, we don't really have much congruity, and that's partially because you guys descended from the Catholics, or, I mean, I don't know how the Lutherans phrase that. That's the way I see it, but descend from the Catholics. And so there's this about 500-year gap, So I kind of looked at the Catholic Orthodox first, so I didn't really even get to the same historic Protestants, because to me, looking at the first 1,000 years, that's pretty important. And when I look at the Catholic Church and its claims now, I mean, hindsight's 20/20, right?
Yeah.
So there's definitely a hindsight is 2020. Vatican II was untenable for me. I think Vatican I with papal infallibility, there's no historical evidence for it. Maybe there's minute historical evidence, but I think generally evidence goes against it, not in favor of it. And of course, let's quote mine church fathers. Let's get into the quote mine, but I don't think that solves the problem because that's once again just whose church is speaking. I think when you look at 1054 AD, right, and you look at the schism, I find the Orthodox argument to be more appealing. That the Catholics started it, and it's all these things, but generally it was a mutual schism. Like most scholars compel that it was like a mutual schism. Most people don't say, well, the Catholics started, the Orthodox started it. We'll say the cardinals to the patriarch said submit to Rome. They said no, and then they formally
both sides have other reasons, but I will be biased and say the Catholics were getting a little bit wonky up there.
Yeah. Right. And so I think to me we have our reasons, but I think when looking at the trajectory of the churches 1,000 years later, I've been blessed by having that 2020 hindsight, and you don't see the same problems in the East that the West is currently facing, right? And that's not to excuse the East just because it's not the West, right? So it's obviously not going to have the same problems. It has a host of different problems. But when looking at how the church operates and functions, there is a place to say, we didn't need a Reformation. You know what I mean? We didn't have a Reformation. It was just, as you said, a constant enhancement as it spread across the globe and grew. And I just agree with St. Gregory of Palamas when it comes to energy essence distinction. I think that makes much more intuitive sense to me than a divine simplicity.
Yeah.
But in the neo-Thomists today, I would disagree. But yeah, I think ultimately that's going to be where I land on my own conversion story. It's just assessing the claims, and then ultimately coming to a conclusion of on a historical note, there's this, and then also on a practical note, hindsight, there's this, and then lastly, I do believe it. Conviction does come, and when you are convicted, you have to operate on that conviction.
Yeah.
I always tell people, if you're not convicted, don't come, right? Because there has to be a belief propelling you, right, in your actions, and your habits, and the way you live. And there's going to be times when the belief gets lower and the belief gets higher. I'm not denying that, when it ebbs and flows. But in the end, there is that kernel, that mustard seed, that is giving us an operation saying, we are convicted on this, right? It would have been much easier for me after all my experience to say, well, I'm going to continue to be Protestant because it's easier to be Protestant in America. I mean, it is. It intuitively is. It is in politics. It is in just way of life, whether we like it or not. America's a Protestant country. And I think, at least historically speaking, and I'm of the mindset that I'm convicted of the claims the Orthodox Church makes, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And those will be against me moving forward, but that's okay because conviction is conviction, and better to be a man of conviction than a man without.
Well, what you put on is just one of the biggest priorities that people need to come across when it comes to switching churches. Because I mean, just a big problem right now is that people look at the idea of theology and sees it as just more of a spectrum of how you live your life, how you live your culture.
Right.
And so, because the way that we Lutherans are structured is that we're very Protestant, but at the same time very Catholic. And so, this is for every generation since the beginning of time. When you're trying to be traditional, but also trying to be freely to what you think biblical truth is, you're going to have so many people that won't be taking it as seriously. Because probably the biggest problem with that is, when it comes to marriage, there's so many different people, especially Lutherans, that will try to find the love of their life, but then they realize she's not going to, after having a good theological discussion, she doesn't seem to wants to become Lutheran. And so the big temptation comes, even though my convictions are here, but do I really want to give up the love of my life
or
for this?
To convert, date to save. No, I'm just kidding.
But
I'm just kidding.
That's better than what we have, where people they'll get married and they'll either switch to the church for the sole purpose of happiness, which I think is unwise. But I think it's even more unwise to stay the same church body, but then still be married between two churches, which is just terrible. Which
and especially for the children.
Exactly. And so just having spiritual unity is everything. That's why the Eucharist isn't for everyone. You do have to be prepared. You need to realize that you're handling Christ's body and blood, and that's I mean, so important for church unity, and that's in unity between marriage and the creation of God is so important. And so that's why it's so important that you need to be finding spiritual unity between your brothers and sisters of Christ, but at the same time, like you said, the conviction of pursuing the truth is also very biblical too.
Yeah.
You don't want to be settling for things that are just watered down Christianity. You want to actually know what Christ is saying. So, and whether that's through the Lutheran Church, the Orthodox Church, always trying to pursue a truth and also not having unhealthy dialogues, but having healthy dialogues on what we agree, what we disagree is just so important to find that, because doctrine is important. I always say that doctrine is over unity, but when it does come to the spiritual perspective of fighting evil in the world, we needed to be united, especially from the political standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially from the political standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Colton Taussig, thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, it's been a blessing, Ray. It really has, and it's good to catch up.
Yeah, it's good. All right, everyone, thank you so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you next time.
All righty, absolutely. And if it's all right, if I have one final note, to all those who are interested, volunteer. You know what I mean? Just like you were saying, Ray, just start in the very, very smallest place you can. You're going to make a big impact, and you're going to have no idea. So to those who are interested in wanting to just start in politics, wanting to see that change happen, you know, the Republican Party, you know, at least coming from the deputy political director of the Republican Party, the Republican Party needs your help. And we are looking forward to the youth coming in and being able to have, you know, a body that is of all ages. You know what I mean? Just like church, if it's not crying, it's dying. You know, in that same way, I hope the Republican Party can do that too. So please look into volunteering with your local Republican chapter and make the difference you want to see in the world.
I already said my outro, so this is going to be cut out.
Oh, tragic.
All right, Colton.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, absolutely, brother. Have a good one.